begin this evening with the story of Guatemala and the CIA connection. Secretary of State Warren Christopher has announced that neither he nor President Clinton were aware of any CIA connection to a Guatemalan accused of murdering an American innkeeper and a guerrilla fighter who was married to an American woman. In Washington, Eliot Abrams joins us. Also, Robert Torricelli is here. The congressman joins us along with Allan Nairn of The Nation magazine as we begin this part of our follow-up to the CIA Guatemala story. You'll all remember that we had some conversation about this with Jennifer Harberry and others a week ago. I began with Congressman Torricelli. Thank you for coming. Elliot, thank you for coming. Allen, good to have you here. Did Secretary of State Christopher say to you, and a question from you, that he did not know if the CIA was continuing to fund Guatemalan military officials?
I found, Charlie, in my years in Washington to be the most extraordinary answer. I asked whether indeed the Secretary of State of our country knew, now that the United States has further suspended military assistance to Guatemala, whether or not there was a covert program by the intelligence community to fund the Guatemalan military. He chose his words very carefully, and it was very clear. He doesn't know.
How is that possible, that knowing what questions he would face, he wouldn't be able to, with the president's authority, find out?
Oh, I think President Clinton's going to find out. But I think the reasons the Secretary of State cannot answer that question are the same as why Bill Clinton was misled in what happened with the deaths of Michael Devine and the husband of Jennifer Harberry. The President had been asking questions for months. The administration wanted to know. The intelligence community simply would not reveal the truth.
Take it from the time that your story, which appeared in the New York Times, in which you disclose a letter to the President about this. What's happened since then? What's been the CIA response? Where are they? What new developments have taken place?
Well, for the briefest of times, the Central Intelligence Agency argued that it did not know when, in fact, Jennifer Harberry's husband was killed, or more details about Michael Devine, and would acknowledge little. But clearly, Bill Clinton must have been outraged, because that story quickly began to unfold. And there was as close to an acknowledgement as you'll ever get out of the intelligence community that, in fact, this Colonel Alperez, who we now know was responsible for both murders, not only was known to the CIA to be a murderer, but in fact was on the payroll. And most startling, almost unbelievably, that months after they knew that he had killed an American citizen, he remained on the CIA payroll and, in fact, was paid, according to the New York Times, $60,000.
Tell me what you have found out, Allen. You've got a story that's in The Nation magazine called CIA Death Squad. Americans have been directly involved in Guatemalan army killings. What can you add to this story before I go to Elliot in Washington?
Alperez is one colonel on the CIA payroll who committed two murders. From talking to both Guatemalan and U.S. operatives involved in this, it's clear that there are many, perhaps dozens of Guatemalan military officers on the CIA payroll who've been involved in thousands of killings. The G2, the Military Intelligence Service, which coordinates the assassinations and disappearances, their top officials have for years been paid by the CIA. I was able to learn the names of three of them who've been on the payroll, as well as General Hector Gramajo, General Roberto Mata, two of the top officers, closest U.S. protégés who've been directly involved in commanding massacres in the Northwest Highlands. Furthermore, there are actual U.S. CIA agents who work directly inside the G2. I was able to learn the names of two of them, Joe Giacarino and Randy Capister. They provide what's called technical assistance and advice. I was able to reach Colonel Alperez on the phone in Guatemala. He denied being involved in the Devine and Bamaka killings, said the CIA wasn't paying him. But he talked rather extensively about how the CIA essentially helps to run the G2 with ongoing advice and American advisors right there inside this systematic killing operation.
You recorded this conversation?
No. I took extensive notes on it. And it's not just the CIA. It's the Pentagon, the State Department, and the White House as well. For example, I mean, here are some internal State Department records which indicate that during both the Bush and Clinton administrations, after there was a supposed cutoff of military aid to Guatemala, the State Department authorized at least 114 separate sales of pistols and rifles to Guatemala. The U.S. military has been planning joint maneuvers with the Guatemalan military this spring. I mean, this is an across-the-board policy, and you have to hold the president accountable for that.
Elliot, you were Assistant Secretary of State for Latin American Affairs during the Reagan administration. Tell me what you make of this story, what you know about what went on during the Reagan administration, and perhaps what you have learned about this story since it broke.
I may not know as many facts about this as Bob Torricelli does, but from what I can see, there's a lot less here than meets the eye. The fact that the CIA maintains relationships with intelligence people and military people in Central America and throughout the world is not news. The fact that some of them are pretty unattractive people is not news. Whether this colonel is in fact responsible for those murders, I'm not sure. Some people have been convicted for the murder of Mr. Devine, so it's not clear to me that, and he's not one of them, it's not clear to me that he was involved in that. I don't think, on the basis of the facts I know, that the CIA found out about his involvement and sat on it. My information is that they did report it to Washington, at least to the Department of Justice.
Reported it to CIA in Washington. You're saying the bureau chief in Guatemala reported it back to Washington, to Langley?
And it was reported then by the CIA to the Justice Department. Now, that we had an ongoing CIA program in Guatemala at a time when there was a military cutoff, you can't do that without a finding that's got to be approved by the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. So one question to ask is, if the Intelligence Committees didn't like this, why didn't they stop it? I just think that before we start jumping up and down here and saying this is another case of the CIA out of control, here I think I might agree with Mr. Nairn that if this was a Bush and Clinton policy, then let's talk about the policy of the president in both cases, and let's not start talking about a rogue CIA, which does not yet appear to me to exist.
Well, let me just ask you a question, hypothetical. Would you, as a Assistant Secretary of State for Latin American Affairs, if you found out that our government was paying a man in the Guatemalan military after it learned that he had been implicated, this is a hypothetical, in the assassination of an American or someone married to an American, would you be outraged? If they were paying him after they learned he'd been involved in the murder of Americans or people married to Americans?
I would certainly be outraged in the Devine case, which looks like the cold-blooded murder of an innocent American. The notion that we would continue to employ such a person would give him and others in the Guatemalan military the sense that we just didn't care about the killing of American citizens. The Bamaka case is a different case. That guy was a guerrilla, and he was not an American.
Yeah, but he wasn't killed in battle. He was killed in prison.
No, but it is a different case, and the responsibility that we have is to protect, above all, American citizens, not Guatemalan guerrillas. So it is a different case, different kind of level of seriousness for the U.S. government.
Alan.
Charlie, you asked a hypothetical. How would Mr. Abrams react? In fact, we have this historical record. We can see how he and the other Reagan and Bush and Clinton officials have reacted. And
in the State Department or in the CIA or both?
Across the board. And in the face of this systematic policy of slaughter by the Guatemalan military, more than 110,000 civilians killed by that military since 1978, what Amnesty International has called a government program of political murder, the U.S. has continued to provide covert assistance to the G2. And they have continued, especially during the time of Mr. Abrams, to provide political aid and comfort. For example, during the Northwest Highland massacres of the late 80s, when the Catholic Church said, never in our history has it come to such grave extremes, it has reached the point of genocide. President Reagan went down, embraced Rios Montt, the dictator who was staging these massacres, and said he was getting a bum rap on human rights. In '85, when human rights leader Rosario Godoy was abducted by the army, raped and mutilated, her baby had his fingernails torn out, the Guatemalan military said, oh, they died in a traffic accident. The human rights groups contacted Mr. Abrams, asked him about it. He wrote back, this is his letter of reply. He said, yes, there's no evidence other than that they died in a traffic accident. This is a woman raped and mutilated, a baby with his fingernails torn out. I want to come to Congressman Torricelli. This is long-standing policy.
In a moment, but these are specific points raised by Alan having to do with your
I'll tell you, whatever Allan Nairn wants to do, Charlie, I'm not here to refight the Cold War. I'm glad we won. Maybe he's not. What I'm here to say is we're talking not about U.S. policy in the world.
One against who? One against those civilians the Guatemalan army was massacring?
Wait a minute. We're not here to refight the Cold War. We're here to talk about, I thought, a specific case in which an allegation is being made that the husband of an American, in another case an American citizen, were killed, and there was a CIA connection with, allegedly, with the person allegedly involved in it. Now, I'm happy to talk about that kind of thing. If Mr. Nairn thinks we should have been on the other side in Guatemala, that is, we should have been in favor of a guerrilla victory, I disagree with him.
So you're then admitting that you were on the side of the Guatemalan military?
I am admitting that it was the policy of the United States under Democrats and Republicans, approved by Congress repeatedly, to oppose a communist guerrilla victory anywhere in Central America, including in Guatemala.
A communist guerrilla victory. 95% of these victims are civilians, peasant organizers, human rights leaders, priests, assassinated by the U.S.-backed Guatemalan army.
I'm happy to invite both of you back to review Reagan and Bush administration policy. Right now, I do want to stick to this point because there seems to be a difference in terms of what you said, Eliot Abrams, and what Robert Torricelli said about the specifics of this in terms of what you think that there's much to be made out of this, too much is being made out of this, and your point, in fact, you have had the most accusatory things to say about the CIA being out of control.
Well, and in fairness, Elliot, I think there are some nuances to some of these points of which he may not be aware. When Michael Devine was killed, soon thereafter, the Central Intelligence Agency had information that he was implicated in, if not the direct death, they at least knew right away in the cover-up of it. Months later, he continued on the payroll. When they learned that he was directly responsible for his death, they decided to terminate the payments. But they met with him, paid him an additional $60,000, made a judgment not to refer this to prosecutorial authorities. And although they may or may not have made payments after that...
Prosecutorial authorities in Guatemala or...
Or to inform the Justice Department at that point, or the Guatemalan government. They did maintain a relationship with him after that point. This is in the death of an American. Now, there's an additional credibility problem for the United States government that goes beyond policy. In a proud moment of the Bush administration, the Secretary of State comes forward and announces we are going to suspend aid to Guatemala because they have not solved the Michael Devine murder. And the Congress was indeed very pleased. Now we discover, last week, that the Central Intelligence Agency, in a covert program, dollar for dollar, replaced the public aid of the United States government to Guatemala with its own covert foreign aid
with
program.
The knowledge of the State Department?
It is not clear. And the Secretary of State of the United States still cannot answer that question.
With the knowledge of the intelligence committees? I mean, wasn't there a finding for
the Oversight Committee in the Congress? Did they not know?
Members of the Intelligence Committee tell me they did not know. And Elliot, what's important is your successor, Bernie Aronson, who was administering American policy to Latin America,
who was a Democrat when appointed by the Bush administration.
Was a Democrat, but appointed by the Bush administration, did not know, and the American ambassador to Guatemala did not know. The State Department was maintaining a public policy. The Congress was told a policy. We don't know whether or not President Bush even knew that his own policy was being subverted by the intelligence community.
Bob, you know
wait 1 second. I'll come right back to you. Go ahead, Elliot.
Well, the head of the CIA in those days, if I recall correctly, was Judge William Webster, one of the most cautious and prudent men that's ever run the CIA. If what you're saying is true, Bob, if it's exactly right, then you had an operation here which was being concealed from Congress and the State Department. I would find it, maybe it's true, in which case it really is scandalous, but I'm going to wait until I find out that it is true, because my experience is that there are a lot of people who conveniently say they didn't know what the CIA was doing. For example, in the case of mining the harbors in Nicaragua, where a lot of people on the Hill forgot what they were told. So maybe some people in the intelligence committees now all of a sudden have a memory lapse, and maybe some people in the State Department do. It's a fact question. I can't answer it.
It's a fact question, Elliot, and either alternative, however, is extraordinarily troubling.
Yes.
Either A, the United States government was maintaining a point of principle that was canceling aid, and George Bush signed a finding to allow it to go on covertly when he was taking credit for canceling it. There's one problem. Or alternatively, George Bush thought he was canceling it, and the Central Intelligence Agency had its own foreign policy and subverted the president's policy. Like Elliot, I don't know which one it was.
You were saying, Elliot, even that you'd be surprised if that was true, and it would be scandalous if it was.
Absolutely.
It's one of the two.
Right.
And let's look at reality here. In reality, we're not talking about 2 murders, 1 colonel. We're talking about more than 100,000 murders, an entire army, many of its top officers, employees of the U.S. government. We're talking about crimes, and we're also talking about criminals. not just people like the Guatemalan colonels, but also the U.S. agents who've been working with them, and the higher level U.S. officials. I mean, I think you have to apply uniform standards. President Bush once talked about putting Saddam Hussein on trial for crimes against humanity, Nuremberg-style tribunal. I think that's a good idea. But if you're serious, you have to be even-handed. If we look at a case like this, I think we have to start talking about putting Guatemalan and U.S. officials on trial. I think someone like Mr. Abrams would be a fit subject for such a Nuremberg-style inquiry. But I agree with Mr. Abrams that Democrats would have to be in the dock with him. The Congress has been in on this. The Congress approved the sale of 16,000 M16s to Guatemala. In 87 and 88,
hold on one second, because
they voted more military aid than the Republicans asked for.
Again, I invite you and Elliott Abrams back to discuss what he did. But right
thanks,
now,
Charlie. But I
hold on one second, Elliott. Go ahead. You want to repeat the question of you want to be in the dock?
It is ludicrous. It is ludicrous to respond to that kind of stupidity. This guy thinks we were on the wrong side in the Cold War. Maybe he personally was on the wrong side. I am one of the many millions of Americans who
Mr.
think
Abrams, you were on
happy
the wrong side in
win.
supporting the massacre of peasants and organizers.
What I want to do is
I want to
ask the following
Absolutely,
question.
and that's a crime. That's a crime, Mr. Abrams, for which people should be tried.
You have read this
right. We'll put all the American officials who won the Cold War in the dock.
All right. You have read this article.
I have read the article.
Yeah. Did you find anything that your information contradicts in this article by Allan Nairn in The Nation magazine? You have said it's the talk of Washington, this article.
Every day this story has surpassed expectations of the day before, even in Washington, where people tend to be cynical on these things. What this article suggests to us is rather than a few Guatemalan military officers who've abused rights, that indeed the entire military leadership of Guatemala may be rife with U.S. informants.
And also that there are disturbing connections between American agents in Guatemala and the activities of what can be called nothing more than killer squads. Yes?
Yes, correct.
There's death squad activity in which the intelligence communities of the United States have been deeply involved. I don't want to get into this debate about the Guatemalan Civil War. I only want to say this, that the United States had no role in being this deeply involved in the Guatemalan military, being this involved in these death squad activities. There was no effort to separate ourselves. I think when all is said and done, we're going to find that there have been rogue operations within the United States intelligence community, outside of the control of even the Director of Central Intelligence. Guatemala has been handled as a backwater of the intelligence community of the United States, its own private preserve.
For what objective?
I think we're headed for some very startling weeks ahead.
To learn what? I mean, tell me what it is that was at stake here and what is going to be so startling that might be discovered. Give me a preview of what you think is around the corner.
I think that there were operations of the intelligence community, of individuals in that community, that were engaged in activities beyond the policies and the scope of the United States government for a variety of purposes. That's as much as I'm going to say. But I think we're headed here for some startling revelations.
Without naming names, what kinds of activities?
I think there were a variety of illegal activities taking place.
This is more than giving money to people who are going out killing Americans or spouses of Americans. You're talking about Americans who you believe might have been, in some cases, involved in committing the acts themselves?
I don't believe that the likes of a Webster or a Gates or a Woolsey, directors of the Central Intelligence Agency, would be condoning or even knowledgeable of the kinds of activities that we're now hearing about occurred in Guatemala.
I assume you would agree with that, Elliott.
Well,
that all
we'll
this
find
could
out.
take
Let's say
place
if they were
without
not
it being
aware,
reported up the line to the director.
If all of this happened and none of them were aware, one has to say what kind of managers were they. I would urge Bob Torricelli to stick to the facts and to avoid the kind of crackpot theories that we're getting from Mr. Nairn. If you stick to the facts, there may be quite enough to get people's attention.
Well,
but I also have to say that Allan Nairn is a distinguished reporter who won the George Polk Award last year. So, I mean, you know, I don't want him characterized on this broadcast as a crackpot. I mean, you can have a personal argument about what he says about you specifically, but go ahead.
When a guy tells me that he thinks that the entire American leadership during the Cold War needs to have a Nuremberg trial, he's a crackpot.
Okay, I mean, I would... Well, point well taken.
It's Mr. Abrams' right to say whatever he wants, but the facts speak for themselves. And in the case of Guatemala, you have this ongoing pattern of murder, which has been public record. The Catholic Church in Guatemala has documented it. All the human rights groups have documented it. And on the public level, not even talking about the covert level, year after year, the U.S. Has continued to provide all different kinds of aid to the Guatemalan military. Right now, it's the Clinton administration that's talking about a joint maneuver with the Guatemalan army. It's the State Department that was licensing these 114 pistol and rifle sales. The idea of a rogue operation is really preposterous when you have this kind of systematic, ongoing program that stretches back over years, over both Democratic and Republican administrations.
I got one last question, Robert Torricelli. I think you know this better than anyone else. One, what's happened to Colonel Alvarez?
Colonel Alvarez remains in the Guatemalan military. He is claiming that he never received payments from the United States.
To Allen in a phone conversation.
He's threatening libel suits. I suggested he come to the United States under oath with threat of perjury, or write to the State Department and ask that his file be released.
And what's the...
In fact, the question of whether he received payments is not seriously debated in Washington. Charlie, what I think people should know, though, of real concern about this is this debate that we're having here may never be settled. As you know, we have had informants now from the National Security Agency that have written to me, communicated with other news media in Washington.
On NSA stationery.
On NSA stationery, that the files and computer records regarding Army and CIA activities in Guatemala this week were being systematically destroyed. So whether or not there was knowledge, whether or not the activities I'm suggesting might have occurred, the fact is we may never know, and therefore never learn any lessons about civilian control of the CIA.
Any fear you're out on too far on a limb on this?
From the day this began, I was afraid I was too far out on a limb, and every day I wake up to find the limb has moved way out beyond me. This is moving very quickly. But I am aware of the fact that, given the sources we now have, that the evidence may be destroyed, and we may never know.
Yeah. Robert Torricelli, Congressman of the United States from New Jersey, a Democrat, Allan Nairn from Nation magazine, Eliot Abrams, former Assistant Secretary of State for Latin American Affairs in the Reagan administration. Thank you very much. Pleasure. Last word to you, Eliot. Anything you want to add to this?
I would just
Since you're in Washington.
I would just urge Bob Torricelli again. The facts may be dynamic enough. Let's just all stick to the facts and go no further than they take us.
And this is mass murder. This country should not be supporting it. If Americans knew about it, they wouldn't stand for it.
All right. Thank you all. We'll be right back. Frank Israel is here. He is a terrific architect from Los Angeles, and we'll talk about his work and his ideas about architect. He's been associated with some of the great architects in America. Back in a moment. Stay with us.